Well, in 2010, I had been suffering from complex autoimmunity for approximately 4 years, potentially longer. I became cognizant of it when I was writing my master's thesis, and this becomes an important part of the story. And so as I'm writing this thesis, I start to have all of these random physical symptoms. At least they felt random to a 25-year-old. And some of it were things like the hands locking, turning purple, jaw locking quite often. At that time, there was no known history of TMJ or anything that ought to have triggered that. And when it hit a fatal range, it took the compromised lungs and the compromised kidneys, which were causing the back pain, with it. I fell somewhere during the shift, hit my head, resulting in a traumatic brain injury. The combination of these symptoms leads to coma. So I'm helicoptered from my family's home to Hopkins, where they knew I was set to be a patient. Unfortunately, I hadn't yet been seen there, which adds a complication to the story. Yet for me, my NDE begins in ICU. All of a sudden, I see from above all of these doctors in hazmat suits working on this human. And I'm very much me in this state of consciousness from above. I still have my personality. I still have my way of thinking. I'm playful, curious. I even observed the colors they were wearing. I remember knowing I was in Maryland and thinking it was odd they were wearing Lakers colors, having come from Los Angeles. And so I'm thinking things like this, and then suddenly I lean deeper into it energetically and know that body isn't just something to be curious about. That body was mine. And suddenly there's this awareness that I'm me, but I'm not in there. And there's this attachment and almost this like frenetic wanting to return back to the soma. So I attempt to move inward as this consciousness. And as I'm beginning to try to get back in or toward the body, I'm yanked up at the speed of light out of the earth realm into a space I can only describe as the juiciest, brightest, most luminescent, iridescent cosmos. And in this space, there is light everywhere, but there is also pockets of darkness and vast space continuing on what looks like infinity. And so I begin to just kind of pivot my energy, which is really just an orb of consciousness. And as I do that, I begin to notice that whatever other light I become in synergy with, my own consciousness becomes. So there's an immediate communal aspect of it. Moreover, the first lights that I am greeted by are lights that are very familiar and very sacred to me. They were these jewel tones, these beautiful, breathtaking jewel tones, an amethyst, a ruby, and a very beautiful emerald. There was also pockets of this very cobalt indigo blue kind of shimmering through everything. And when I met these particular lights, there was a safety, there was a familiarity, there was an awe, and there was also a bliss of knowing I was in the company of lights of intelligence that I had known. I had been a highly intuitive, sensitive child since I had incarnated on Earth. However, I was born to a very religious family, and when, as a child, I had described seeing angels and orbs of light, I had been told that was witchcraft and not to engage with such things. However, I continued to do it throughout my childhood and lifespan in secrecy. And so when these lights appear and there's just this safety, there's this surrender to I'm safe, whatever this is. And the only feeling that came through when that safety was accepted was divine, unconditional love. And it held me in a way I had never been held on the earth walk. I felt mothered and received with a tenderness that had never come close to me as a human. I had been a complex trauma survivor since my very early youth and just was not met with that kind of reciprocity and gentleness. In this space, I was held by it, but I was also one with it. And that allowed for a little bit of playfulness with my own light being and the light beings around me. As I'm exploring this vast terrain, I begin to feel a magnetic pull, And this pull is gravitational, and it is just so strong and so robust. And as I'm being anchored in to this beautiful, but also fierce, ultraviolet white light, I begin to also feel a little bit of a pull back, wherein my angelics, these beautiful jewel tone light beings, they did not communicate by words. Nothing in my experience was said in our traditional language. It was all through an intuitive inner knowing, downloads, and telepathy. As I begin to pull back a bit, these light beings tell me, you are welcome to go to that light. You are that light. All things are that light. You are a fractal of that light. And you may go now, or you will ultimately return here and reunify with it. Of course, I wanted to go towards that light. It felt so good. And as I got closer, that frequency of unconditional love seemed to grow larger and larger. And so I began to go towards it. However, that pull gets stronger and stronger and stronger at the same time. And so there's almost like this push-pull energetically happening. And it's not uncomfortable, but it is intense. And during that moment, or that feeling state, as everything was sensation, the angels communicate to me that I do not have to go back to the body. It is a choice. And if I choose it, I will be able to complete what my individual soul had come to earth for. It wasn't mandated. It wasn't necessity. It was the opportunity. However, if I reunified with the light and creator, then inevitably the aspects of my soul that had split from this source being and had certain duties to live out and to gain wisdom through, it would opt eventually to return. And as a complex trauma survivor, as someone who had endured tremendous amounts, decades of grief and loss and pain, I did not want to go back to that, but I also didn't want to repeat it. And so, as if sensing my trepidation, or as if giving me an invitation of what might be, I was then shown an image of the earth. And this earth was not the way I'd seen the earth in our photos from NASA or in my own understanding of it. It was as luminous as that creator light. And around it were a bunch of figures, humanoid-like, but the most defining point would be that hands. You could see the hands, and they were all connected in a circle, not touching, but connected. And from that circle emanated this very beautiful halo-like citrine color. And it was very evident that they were transmitting something to the earth that was amplifying her vibration, her frequency, her intelligence. They didn't say anything else about that. They didn't label it. They didn't describe it. They did let me know that what I was witnessing or receiving would not happen for approximately 10 years. It was the only cue they gave me. And so, interested, curious, not really sure my role in all of that. But as I began to ponder it, I just received a flooding, a very gentle waves of downloads. And it was intuitively understood and known that I was to hold with those other beings that light. And that light somehow was medicine for all of the trauma and all of the things that I had been through. And so at that point, I tell the angelics, I want to go back. I don't know why, but I really want to go back for that. That's what I signed up for. And they were like, absolutely. And they're like, however, with the gentlest way you can say this in light and feeling and sensation, should you choose to return, it will not get easier. That 10-year window is significant, not just for you, but all of humanity. And we want to be very transparent that it's going to hurt. And I'm like, it's all good. I'm all here for it. Take me back. And, if they described what would come next, I probably would have made a different decision. Yet in the safety of that unconditionality and that love, it felt okay. And so I asked the angelics, how do I get back? How do I begin to return to this body? And again, you're beyond time and space and everything goes on infinitely. Some areas being very beautiful and kaleidoscope-like, other areas looking like a dark abyss. And I did not feel powerless, but I felt unsure. And anytime my uncertainty was sensed, there was an answer that came forward. And so they guided me towards, as it was felt or known to me, a light unlike any other. However, as I began pivoting my consciousness towards this light, I first encounter two very beautiful yet very soft lights. They weren't as robust, they weren't as loud as the angelics or the source light or the God light. They also didn't communicate, unlike all the other forms of light in this space. I was curious about them. I felt as if in a way they wanted me to hold them, but they said nothing. And so I carried on, kept moving. At some point herein, I see this blinding light that just almost hurts. And at that moment, the shift occurs where my consciousness is catapulted back into a very broken body. And the first thing that I see upon landing is this piercing artificial light. They had been checking my vital signs. And so that light that anchored me back in was actually quite literally a flashlight that pulled me. As I'm dropped back into the body, I have no awareness, no cognition of what has occurred. I didn't know my liver had failed. I didn't know my liver was failing. And so I'm dropped and plummeted back into this body. And suddenly it's as if I've been thrown into cement. I realize instantaneously, in a bit of panic, after leaving this space of radical, unconditional love, suddenly I'm in this concrete-like feeling and I can't move. I can't move because my lungs had failed and they had intubated me. But more importantly, because of the severity of the brain trauma and the fact that doctors believed I had a 1% chance of survival, they had put a PICC line into my brain to try to save what little brain activity they had seen. And so the PICC lines were on both sides of the brain. They have to strap you down because you cannot move when they are going all the way in. So I was strapped down and intubated. I couldn't communicate and I couldn't move. I sit in this state for as long as I sat in coma. I sat for 3 days in coma, 3 days locked in without anyone aware that I was back. I realized intuitively, after some trial and error in this space, paralyzed in the body, that I was keeping myself calm, consciously keeping myself calm. Every time I'd go to a point of panic, I would consciously bring myself back down, as was my training, as was my practice. Suddenly it dawns on me, perhaps I ought to panic. If I panic, those machines will know I'm panicking. They're made to read this. And so I just let go of all of the, grounding that I was doing in that space. And my vitals shot up, at which point another nurse comes over and she realizes that I'm attempting to move, even though I can't move much. So she says to me then, she said, "Can you hear me? If so, blink once for yes, twice for no." I responded. She asked some basic questions like my name and some mental status exam sort of stuff. And my answers were congruent to reality. And at that point, she calls in the medical professionals to say she's awake. And I'm pretty certain, I'll never forget these words, I'm pretty certain her brain's okay. And I'm like, my brain is okay. And at the same time, part of me is like, no, it's not. I'm seeing things. So it would take another 3 days before the intubation could come out. And so when they come in to tell me that miraculously the liver has fully healed, my liver count was 200,000. You were supposed to be dead somewhere over 100 to 140, okay? An optimal liver count is like 40-ish range, okay? 200,000, that's significant damage. And so then the lungs spontaneously heal, the kidneys spontaneously heal, the inflammation just starts to dissolve. So as I'm about to exit the hospital in a wheelchair, because they force you to use a wheelchair, and I didn't want to use a wheelchair because I had taught myself to walk, before the occupational therapist had come in. He comes up to the wheelchair and he's just like, "I don't know what to say, and I'm still perplexed as to how it happened, and I do not use this term lightly." And he's like, "You are a miracle." And he's like, "Something protected you, something that defies science."